Good morning, everyone. I'm April Yee, Director of Education. I know this is an exciting day. I'm glad that you're here, and I appreciate you sticking around in this room before lunchtime. We know that we're between you and lunch, so appreciate your attention. We are witnessing groundbreaking progress in the AANHPI education movement. For the first time, many students nationwide are learning that Asian American history is American history. To date, 12 states have passed laws requiring the teaching of AAPI history in K-12 schools, while 10 states have active legislation that would require the teaching of our history. Education is one of TAAF's core pillars, and today, leading advocates and educators in the movement are here to share the latest updates and exciting opportunities to expand AAPI history in classrooms around the country. We are joined by Vivian Louie, Professor of Urban Policy and Director of Asian American Studies at Hunter College here in New York. Weonhee Shin, Executive Director and co-founder of Asian American Voices for Education. And Harman Singh, Executive Director of the Sikh Coalition, a national organization, a national civil rights organization. All right, so we're going to get started here. Let's start with why education is important. Here at TAAF, we see it as not only a crucial way to build belonging for API students, but also a vital way to fight hate. Weonhee, you're part of a grassroots group of parents, educators, and community members working to promote a comprehensive U.S. history that is taught in Georgia K-12 schools. Abed is one of TAAF's grantees. As a concerned parent, what propelled you to action?
First of all, I'm going to get really comfortable. Even if you said it's just a conversation.
Having a conversation.
So I'm going to sit like a true Korean, like this.
Do it.
And lean back and get comfortable. But I do need to know where the audience is from. Anyone from the South here? If you live there, if you were raised there, whatever, raise your hands really high. I feel you.
There you go, yeah.
Anybody from California, the West Coast? You got it too easy, people in California, I gotta say. What about the Midwest?
Yes, that too.
That's right, I feel you too. Northeast. I lived there for a while. I love you all too. And Texas. I consider them someone separate. Okay. Okay, nice to meet you, everybody. So I am a child immigrant, and I grew up in rural Virginia. And as one of the only Asian kids, school was something I had to do because I had to do it so that I can have a better life for my mom and my family. I'm also the oldest girl. Oldest child in my family, and my mom was a single mom. Yeah. And I went through school doing what I'm supposed to do, but there was never a connection. Anybody can relate to that? K through 12, no connection. I remember I would flip through the books and I would learn about founding fathers. I'm like, they're not my fathers. And then in middle school, I'm going through my world history book and I saw Genghis Khan and I got excited. That's how bad it was, okay? And then 18, I'm like, peace out, I'm leaving you, Virginia. I went to Boston. Anybody been to Boston before?
Yeah.
It is a great place if you're in college. And that's when I became very comfortable in my own skin. And that's when I was able to find my identity. And April, you were sharing a little bit about how that's a lot of people's experience, right, in college. I get married, I have babies, then I moved to Atlanta 9 years ago. And I had a child, my oldest was in elementary school. And what I loved about Atlanta when I moved there was that for the first time, I saw a thriving black middle and upper class. I had never seen it before in Boston, in Virginia, DC, nowhere. In Atlanta, I'm like, this is amazing. And I started reading about Malcolm X and just the Black Power movement and all of it. I'm like, this is incredible. And I see it lived in this city. And my son, my oldest, his name is Aiden. He's in school and he's reading books by black authors. And I'm like, this is incredible. And he goes, 엄마, which is mom in Korean. He goes, but I don't read about any kids who look like me. And I'll be honest with y'all, I didn't even know that's an option. I didn't even think that's something I can dream of. And I was like, you're right. And then what happened? 2016 happened. And I see all these things happening. I'm in Georgia, George Floyd, and all these conversations, the Muslim ban, and the border, and all this ugliness. And as a Korean American woman in the South, it's very much a black and white binary. I was like, what is my place? Because I see all these yard signs and people getting really hot about this, but I know movements, a lot of times they die. And I'm like, this has been the lived experience for so many people for hundreds of years. Why do you care all of a sudden? If you care all of a sudden, you're going to stop caring all of a sudden, too. And I thought, I'm not white, I'm not black, so what is my place in this? So it was an internal struggle. And then what happens? COVID. And I see people like me in Atlanta, spa shooting, all these things happening. And you know what one of the beauties of COVID honestly was? This happened. People started expressing themselves in the media. And my identity was affirmed for the first time. I didn't know what microaggression was. And I read it, I'm like, okay, I'm not crazy. And then I start reading about history, all these like Zoom calls. I've never even touched Zoom. By the way, once I started having kids, I tell people I was a professional ass wiper, stay-at-home mom. So, you know, I was like separate from this world of all these, you know, work and Zoom and all that. So I'm attending everything. I'm like, gosh, I want to learn more about Asian American history. Can I learn it? Guess what? There was 0 Asian American history program back then, 3 years ago, in Georgia. Actually, south of Maryland, east of Texas, Georgia hired 1. In the Southeast, they had 1 Asian American history professor. So think about that. That's why I say California, you're lucky. And so what happens is I'm learning about Asian American studies and history, and I see that our history connects. Do you know who the first undocumented immigration was? And this is Dr. Erica Lee's book. I learned it was a Chinese migrant workers from south of the border. They were coming through Mexico because of the Exclusion Act. And that's when I started seeing my neighbors who were undocumented coming through the border differently. It became very personal. When I learned about all the exclusion acts, you know, that barred Asians, when I saw the Muslim ban, it became a repetition of our history all over again. So current events became very personal, and that's when I realized that movement of just a sign can be more when history becomes personal. And I was like, you know what? Our children deserve to know that when they're young. Not when they're a 37-year-old woman, but when they're young as children so they can start humanizing one another and personalize our realities. So that's it.
Thank you. It's awesome. It's awesome. All right, that's so powerful. I'm just reiterating sort of how powerful that can be. New research from the Status Index reveals that 41% of Americans believe that teaching history of Asian American in K-12 schools, in Americans in K-12 schools, could actually decrease racism. And Harman from the Sikh Coalition has been fighting to get accurate information about Sikhs, which is the 5th largest religion in the world, into classrooms. 19 states plus Washington, D.C. have moved to include accurate information about Sikhs in their standards. So what changes have you seen since this has happened?
Yeah, I mean, Weonhee, I can relate a lot to what you mentioned here. I know backstage we were talking about this, right? I grew up as the only Sikh in my school. My brother and I were the only ones. And largely, we were the only non-white students in our entire school district, right? I grew up in a city that was, at the time, considered one of the whitest cities in America. And so as a very visible minority, right, I always wore a turban. That had a real impact on the way I viewed myself and the way I viewed myself within the larger ecosystem. And I did the same thing. Every year I would go to the index and I would say, is anything mentioned about the Sikh community? And for 12 years I was disappointed because it never was. A lot of those considerations and concerns really crystallized post 9/11, right? I remember on September 12th, I walked into school and I was called a terrorist immediately. And more than hearing that, what really stuck with me is the friends that I had known since elementary school slowly backed away because they didn't want to be associated with that label either. But more than that, the teachers also didn't say anything and never acknowledged that this even happened. And so I share this not because my experience is unique, but actually because it's very common within the community, and a lot of our students are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. And we all know this anecdotally within our communities, right? We know our students are dealing with this violence, we know they're dealing with microaggressions and hatred and discrimination, but we also have data to support this. And so last month, the Sikh Coalition launched a new study. We surveyed over 2,000 Sikh students from 30 different states, and what we found was a confirmation of what we already know, but also a real indication that we have much further to go. And so what we found is that 77% of Sikh students report at least one bullying incident. And 10% of those students say they've been bullied by a teacher or a staff member.
Wow.
And so the data is striking, it's alarming, and that's the reason we do the state standards work to get Sikhism included in all of our classrooms. And so the most transformative part of it for me is not necessarily even the end product, right? Inclusion of Sikhism in standards is important. It's a great step towards folks actually learning about our communities and our students. The real transformative part is actually the process to get there, which is engagement with the community. And the greatest part that I've seen is when we have Sikh students standing before the superintendent, before the Board of Education, and they assert, my community's history matters, I matter, and I will not accept exclusion of our communities from your classrooms. And that is the strongest part, because over the past 20 plus years that we've been doing the work, more and more we see that Sikh students both believe they have agency and see the agency they have in this process. And within the Sikh community, I don't view myself as a victim of the bullying that I experienced. The things that I went through have propelled me to be working in education, to do civil rights work, and we have this idea of Chardhi Kala in our community, which is eternal optimism. And that eternal optimism is what drives us to continue this work, because we know that the state standards part is just one part of it. It's a starting point. That is not the end goal, because it doesn't determine fully whether or not the inclusion is meaningful, if it actually represents our communities, if educators know how to teach about our communities, and we want to make sure that we continue to build off of that model going forward.
That's right. That's right. I love that. Yeah, the eternal optimism really resonates. We were talking in the back room just about hope and how we maintain hope, and hope as a discipline, so I really appreciate the eternal optimism note. And so there is a healthy debate about, sort of state mandates, and is that the best way to go versus, policy legislation or state standards being written into education code. What are other ways, Vivian, I'll ask you, if not state mandates or education code, what's the best way or other ways to ensure that our history is taught in the classrooms?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, April, for the invitation, to TAAF for the invitation, and to be on this great panel. So definitely, I think for me the question is, how do we get people to really come into this space and think that this content is so important, this curriculum? And this builds on the points that we had done in our, our panel prep, right? But how do we get a fully integrated curriculum? How do we get a fully integrated curriculum where people see one's connection to other people, to other groups? It's not just about our group, right? That's not the history of the United States. The history of the United States is all the groups that have been here, right, that have built this country. And then how can we get folks who have never learned this content, right, in K through 12 education or higher education, into that space? How can they advocate for something that they don't even know anything about, or that they know so little about? Right, not everyone is going to do what you did, Weonhee, right, which is awesome, which is to really kind of dive in and learn about this on your own. So how can we make that space, that opportunity for folks? So certainly one way to do it is through public programming events in higher education. So I direct Asian American Studies at Hunter College. In 2019, we launched the Asian American Studies Center to do exactly that, right? To do this kind of public programming that folks need. But that's not the only thing that we should be doing, right? We need this kind of knowledge to be shared in our public libraries. It's a great space. Let's use it. Right, we need this knowledge to be shared in nonprofits, in community nonprofits. How many of you are affiliated with community nonprofits in our nation? And now you're silent. Okay, yes, okay. So, but that's a really core place that it should be doing, right? Where we should be doing this work. So I can only speak for New York City, which is where I'm from and which is where I live. So I pitched this idea to the Center for an Urban Future that the New York City government should incentivize this learning through nonprofits serving different communities across different zip codes. If people living across different zip codes don't learn about one another, where are they going to learn it? I mean, New York City is an incredibly diverse city, but we don't often connect across zip codes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you're making me remember some of our latest findings from our status index survey. Americans remain largely unaware of key events in Asian American history. So only 17% said they were extremely or moderately familiar with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which is exactly why we need curriculum, we need content. And as the lead scholar of Hidden Voices AAPI curriculum here in New York City, it's being piloted right now for all you native New Yorkers. Can you tell us more what's in that curriculum? Like a favorite lesson, like is it a fun fact or is it a tragic fact that you would want folks to, come to mind besides sort of, the Exclusion Act or railroad workers?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So So the Hidden Voices AAPIs is a great piece of work. You see it on the screen. It's the brainchild of the New York City Department of Education, the DOE. So I want to give a shout out to our Chancellor, David Banks, Lucius Young, Joe Schmidt, Brian Carlin. These are the folks, Linda Lowe, who really, this was their brainchild. AAPIs is one volume as part of a series, right? I also want to give a shout out to my fellow lead scholars, one of whom is in the room, Chris Kwok, I think he's in the back over there, who teaches at Hunter College, Dr. Lynn On, who's also at Hunter, Caitlin Goulding, Dr. Caitlin Goulding there as well. It's a great Hunter team, Dr. Kiyati Joshi at Fairleigh Dickinson. We all kind of work together, Frida Lynn. These are all folks and a whole bunch of wonderful scholars who wrote these profiles. So basically, Hidden Voices, what is it? It's about recovering the voices of people who are missing from the historical record. So one fun thing I'll say about it is that I want to quote Helen Zia, who's going to be here today, or she might already be in the room, yeah, who's awesome, of course, the awesome journalist, activist, writer, right? And she did a commentary with Dr. Erica Lee, right, the Harvard historian, in WAPO, the Washington Post, in which she said, you know, AAPIs, we haven't been MIA, right? We haven't been missing in action. We've been doing the action. I'm paraphrasing, if that's okay, right? But we've been MIH. We've been missing in history, right? All that history has been lost. So I think what Hidden Voices is designed to do through profiles, Helen Zia is one of 38 individuals who've been profiled in there, through essays that were written about the overview of AAPI history, why we need it, what are the benefits and challenges of teaching that history in our K-12 schools, right? What has been AAPI, their contributions in New York City in an annotated map, right? All of that is really designed to recover these voices, to bring them back into the historical record. If we don't have that, how are we going to get there? Yeah. But I do want to say that it's not just about having curriculum, okay? I mean, that's great. That's a wonderful place to start. But how are we going to use the curriculum? How do teachers and educational leaders feel empowered to use this curriculum? You know, they're people too, right? If they never learn this content, how are they going to teach it? They're going to want to do it well. And that's the next step.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So speaking of curriculum, I have exciting news to share. TAAF will be releasing and launching a new learning repository this back-to-school season. It will be a centralized, accessible space for vetted, high-quality curricular resources for K-12 educators to effectively teach API history. So this is just a sneak peek of what it will look like, but stay tuned and get excited because there will be available to everyone. And we will be continually updating the repository with new features and updates over time, so you continue to come back and check out the new information. We'll also be tracking the progress of our movement with a map to understand, how things are evolving and where you can go to learn more, especially educators for professional development. So other than a strong curriculum, we're going to shift to a couple other things. Weonhee, what are some other exciting opportunities to further AANHPI education efforts?
Within the state of Georgia?
Sure, yes, community efforts, what are the things that are happening there?
First, I want to say history is one aspect. That's not it, right? So we call ourselves AVID, A-A-V-E-D, AVID. It's not about just promoting history content. That's definitely a tool that's necessary, but it's how do we create a classroom where kids know they're valued and they have worth, so that they can use their education as catalysts for change. Because if you believe that children are inherently brilliant, you want to give them power-giving education, right? But in order to give children power-giving education, you got to know the historical content, because that explains our realities. There's a reason for everything on realities. Why do we have Asian American business owners? There's a reason for that. Why do people think that we're good at math? There's a reason for that. I mean, our realities, there are laws and systems and histories that determined it. So history is definitely necessary, but that's not it. So the question is, how do you build a classroom environment where school is where kids are spending 7 hours a day for 13 years, a place that they know that they can take their education to become amazing adults, okay? So with that in mind, we have several things that we do, and you can think about how you can do this in your communities. One is actually, you gotta train the teachers early. It's not just about making them learn it, but making them care. And you know what research found? And I'm gonna challenge you to look into this. Pre-service teachers, these are people trained to become teachers. They're young, they're passionate. We see the protesters. When you're young, you care so much more, honestly. And we learned that when people in their first and second year of education school, that kind of determines their entire trajectory of what they're gonna teach in the future. So work with them, because they're gonna have a bigger reach, and they start caring. And someone mentioned in one of the earlier sessions that people of Asian descent are 60% of the world population. That's a lot of history. Mandating like one piece of history, that's not gonna cut it. But if you make people curious and care, that will propel them to learn on their own. Teachers don't go to, become teachers to make money. They do it because they care. They get to their heart. So that's one way. Invest in your pre-service education programs and invest in your teachers because they're there because they care. The second is believe that your kids, the children, all kids are capable to be powerful people. And if you do that, how we approach education will be different. It's not gonna be all about testing. It's not gonna be about memorizing about inventors. It's about how do we do it. Another great example is instead of English as a second language, who knows ESL? I was an ESL. Anybody else when they were a kid? Okay. Instead of that, someone told me, call them multilingual learners. Why do you focus on the fact that English is not knowing English as a first language is a deficit? Embrace the child, right? Look at them and honor them for who they are. If we center on the children, that's how it is. So we actually have youth programs. And we had a youth program after that. Do you know what happened? Kids, 2 high school kids who are in predominantly white neighborhoods, they asked us, can you teach us during the school year? We'll come on the weekends. Just teach us about this. So we're like, okay, we'll do it. We wanted a field trip at 6 in the morning on Saturday. And we had high school seniors. They're done with school, and they wanted to be there. They started interning at a local legislator's office. One kid started an Asian American elective in his school. Like, kids are capable, believe in that, invest in the youth. The other one you can see here is Heritage Month. That is a federally approved month right now. They can't deny us. So I'm like, you know what? We're gonna go to them. So we started creating Heritage Month kits for K through 5 that's very intentional, free. Last year, first year doing it, we're like, let's try to see if we can get 100 classrooms. 300 signed up. 3,000 students received it. It was really for parents to go in and volunteer in the kids' classroom. 60% of people who signed up, guess what? Were teachers. And in Georgia, look it up, we have ugly bills that say you can't teach about race. But still, 60% who signed up were teachers. This year, we're like, well, let's up to 400 classrooms. Remember, 3,000 last year. Someone take a guess. How many students do you think were impacted this year? 13,000 in Georgia.
That's awesome.
I was physically driving to the schools, dropping it off. And I'm telling you, teachers care. So let's start investing, giving them meaningful things to start conversations.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you, Weonhee. So that's really inspiring. And you did note in Georgia, you're not supposed to be teaching about race. And so I do want to talk a bit about the challenges to this work. Harman, DEI and CRT have become hot button issues, critical race theory, especially during an election year. So can you talk to us more about sort of the challenges that you're facing or that we face as a community in teaching our history and some strategies to navigate those challenges?
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is that this is a very well-funded, well-coordinated movement that is being pushed for very political reasons, right? We can't approach this from the perspective of this is all just happening at the local level and these are just small groups of people, right? This is very well-funded and there is an intentional focus on this. And I think part of what we need to do is first understand what is critical race theory, what is DEI, is it actually being taught in our schools, right? By and large, CRT is not being taught in any K through 12 schools.
Right. And
so we have to first understand what are they actually talking about. And as you dig deeper, what you realize what they're talking about is anything outside of the white, heteronormative Christian lens. And that is all encompassing, right? That includes all of our communities. And so I think there has to be a real thoughtful consideration of how we actually approach that. And we've seen it impact our work, right? 10 years ago, we may have been able to go into a state standards review process, and folks may not have been in those meetings, right? Not too many people were paying attention to what was happening with their social studies standards. Today, when we're mobilizing community members to go out and speak at these hearings, we're saying you're gonna have to take the full day off because people will be there commenting for 8 hours. So the amount of attention that's being paid, the focus that people have on what students are learning in classrooms is only escalating. And with that, I think it requires a real coordination among all of us to say, number one, we need to recognize that, you know, a lot of these bills that are quote unquote about divisive concepts, that effectively eliminates the ability to teach accurate history of the AAPI community and the Asian American history, right? How can we teach about Asian American history without talking about systemic racism, white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism? The reason so many of our communities are here in the United States is based off of a lot of these concepts. So if we effectively accept that those concepts are divisive and we don't want to teach them, what we're saying is the history that students will learn about our communities will be very surface level, right? It'll be the food, the music. It'll be very surface level things, not the actual issues impacting our communities, how we arrived here, the challenges we face, and quite frankly, the full breadth and depth of our communities. So understanding that, I think, is critical. And then beyond that, it's also important that we recognize, you know, a lot of these bills right now are targeting LGBTQ and Black communities. As a lot of folks have said today, folks from the LGBTQ and Black communities are also within the Asian American community, right? These are not external issues that are not impacting us. And simultaneously, we need to understand that while it is starting right now in the LGBTQ and Black community specifically, it is only escalating from here, right? This movement is not only focused on one community, it's on all communities to be able to effectively teach about who they are. So how we actually tackle that, I think, is a lot of internal community conversations around these issues. It's a lot of cross-coordination within communities to actually build movement. And I'll give the example. I think, you know, we have some partners from Virginia that are in the room. We led a really strong movement with our partners on the ground in Virginia a year ago, and that movement was really built off the idea that the Sikh community was not being taught accurately or was not included at all. The AAPI community was not being included in any meaningful way. The African American community, their inclusion was being stripped back at the same time. You know, the indigenous community, you know, they're referring to indigenous Americans as immigrants to this country. So there were unbelievably offensive, horrible, historically inaccurate things that were happening. And what was done in Virginia is everyone got together and said, we need to coordinate what is our strategy here because this divisive idea is actually impacting all of us. And we need to now coordinate with the LGBTQ community, within the African American community, AAPI community. What do we need to do to make this actually go forward? And you know, the end result was a much stronger version of what we were up against. And so I think that can serve as a model of cross-community collaboration, but there also has to be inter-community education to actually understand what we're up against here.
Thank you. Yeah, solidarity is the solution, right? That sounds what I heard. I think also you were speaking to sort of the political nature of this work. I mean, I think many of us, it's common sense that we would want our kids to know about our stories and for everyone, you know, to know about our history. There's a short film that we recently commissioned about children, young people who are activists in their local school districts, and I'll just quote, I think he's a 12-year-old boy in Texas saying, you know, is learning about your neighborhood or your neighbors controversial? Is having empathy controversial? Like, why is that up for debate at, you know, a state board of education space? But it is, you know, it obviously is, and so education is highly political. We're seeing that across the country, and so just as a quick, you know, slight pivot to sort of the higher education space, where we know there's a lot of political unrest right now. I wanted to ask, you know, Vivian, you know, there have been some recent wins to expand Asian American studies in higher education. There's also been, you know, pushback. It's going in both directions, but definitely want to celebrate the wins at, you know, Cornell, Amherst, UCLA have recently received increased funding and expanding the program. So, you know, how do you think about the work in higher education right now, and what are you hoping for or looking towards?
Sure. Thank you so much, April. So, I mean, it is an exciting moment in American higher education, despite the challenges, right? Including, of course, the challenges and the benefits in Asian American studies content. So, at Hunter College, you know, I'm really proud, I'm pleased we educate so many Asian American studies content, what we offer that, right? At City University of New York, or CUNY, is the nation's largest public urban university. And Hunter College, which is a part of CUNY, of course, offers the largest Asian American Studies undergraduate program. We educate about 1,200 students every academic year, with a couple hundred more over the summer, right? And we're also the longest continuously running undergraduate program in Asian American Studies at CUNY. So those are great things. I mean, I love to tout that. It's awesome. Yeah. But I also want to say that that's not the only place where this content should be taught. Yeah. This important content that we've all talked about should be threaded throughout the curriculum. Now, why is that? It's because it is, again, the story of Asian Americans is the story of America, right? It's the story of the Immigration Act of 1965, which I would wager impacted a lot of us in this room, right? But how many of us know that it was thanks to civil rights activists that pushed for the Immigration Act of 1965 that reopened large-scale immigration to the United States after 4 decades of a closed-door policy? And that it was thanks to the Immigration Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that we have the nation that we have today, despite all the issues, right? So that's one of the key points that I think that we need to be mindful of. We need to understand that birthright citizenship, mandated supports to English language learners in our public schools, those two things have been thanks to Asian American activism through Supreme Court rulings. All right? It's the 50th anniversary of Lau versus Nichols, dating back to 1974, around English language learners' supports. Okay, we haven't won every fight. I'm not saying that we have. It took until 1952 that all foreign-born Asians in the United States could become naturalized citizens, and not all the fights were legal, right? I mean, you mentioned this, right? Thanks to the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, there were folks who came in, Chinese working-class immigrants, through false papers, right, until 1943. To basically get a toehold in the United States. But the fights were waged. And I think that's really important for us to be mindful of. And I think the last point that I want to make is that, institutional knowledge is also part of hidden voices, right? If we don't go out and remember it and be mindful and intentional, it will also be lost. So I want to give a shout out to the Hunter College Asian American Studies Oral History Project, which I had done with Dr. Lin An, Rochelle Kwan, Luigi Villanueva. The latter two are both community oral history educators. We work together with a team of 12 undergrads at Hunter. Why is this important? Why am I telling you this? Because we learned through that project of the pivotal role of the then Black and Puerto Rican Studies Department in getting Asian American Studies content into Hunter College back in the 1970s and 1980s. One course, that's what we had, one course. But it was thanks to Dr. John Henry Clark, the late Dr. Clark, who really understood why Asian American Studies content mattered, and he fought for it. So we have to understand that. We have to understand that our Hunter College alumni and past and present faculty have staffed, have founded about 20 community-serving nonprofits in New York City serving Asian Americans. Otherwise, we're not going to remember.
That's all I could see. Thank you, Vivian. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to give Weonhee the last word. As someone on the front lines of this work every day, what is one step that anyone in this room can take to help AANHPI education efforts move forward right now?
I will tell you, I am not the smartest person, but I will tell you, start thinking deeply and critically, and think long-term, okay? We have a lot of unlearning and relearning to do. Think long-term in a very critical way, and why I say critically is, look at it. So 80s and 90s, African-American history was mandated in some states. Do African-Americans still face racism and hate? Yes. Right? Can we all agree on that?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
So each one step's not going to solve it all. But how do we start thinking deeply and critically and all these things and instilling that quality in our children so they can observe the world around them and question it? That is the key, and think long term. We're not going to end this in 5 years, 10 years, not even 50 years, I think. It's going to take a long time. So invest your time, your hours, learn about yourself and people around you. I think we really have to start thinking deeply into things, not just the surface level. Celebrate the wins, but think long term. And think about others around you and yourself. So that's my biggest challenge. It's not sexy, honestly, April. It's not like, do this, join this, follow us on Instagram. But it's also start thinking deeply about the issues around you, because there's a reason for it, I'm telling you. And that'll start leading the path to other things. Look up Asian American studies, look up ethnic studies. Anything else y'all want to add? What people should start looking up?
I think the unlearning piece is a big one. You know, as grown-ups in this room or as experts in our roles, we often think that we've learned enough, but we actually have a lot more to learn. I think, you know, the Albert Einstein quote of the more we learn, the less we know, or something like that. I think that really resonates.
Jose Rizal says, know history as in K, know self, like with a K. Know history, know self. And I think that's very deep.
That's great.
Look up solidarity work.
Yes.
That's another great thing.
Long-term work.
Yes.
One other thing I could say too is you don't need legislation or state standards to actually engage in your local communities. You don't need that, right? You can go to your local school district, talk to the school, and figure out ways to get involved. It does not require legislation for you to actually get engaged within your local community.
Absolutely.
I agree.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. Yes, perfect. Yes.